morning. Okay, Jack, you have the floor.
Great. Well, in terms of just to make clear how the changes, how this might change the timing of presentations today. When should I wrap up so that I make sure that that Waylon has a good amount of time? Because we talked about like a 20-minute presentation with some Q&A afterwards.
Yeah, I think you should still be okay for 20 minutes. I was gauging
Okay.
it an hour and a half, so I believe we should still be on track. And if there's questions, we can take those at the end.
Okay, well, I will attempt to take the next technological leap, which would be sharing my screen. Let's see if this is going to cooperate. So can you see my PowerPoint presentation now?
Yes.
Yeah, so good morning, everyone, or good afternoon, depending on what time zone you might be in. My name is Jack Herring, and I work at Western Washington University in Bellingham. My title here is Vice Provost for Undergraduate Education. I'm also a faculty member at the Fairhaven College of Interdisciplinary Studies, and my background and interest there is primarily focused on environmental science and environmental regulation, particularly in the area of air quality and air chemistry and climate change. And one of the things that we do at Western Washington University, as directed by our university leadership, is we make an acknowledgement of tribal lands when we start any official event. And I've posted the statement here that is our officially approved and adopted institutional tribal land statement. And I just want to say, in adding to what our institution says, because I think it is very important for institutions to make statements like this, I also recognize this statement is kind of insufficient in a way from my perspective, to meet what I see as my obligations as someone who is a visitor here in these lands, and recognizes that I work at an institution that has not always been a friendly, welcoming place to tribal members and Indigenous people. So, we've got a lot of work to do. And I also want to acknowledge that at the same time, we have had many members of the Lummi and Nooksack tribe who have been part of our institution and have contributed greatly to our institution, as well as other tribes. And so I don't really like the part, the statement feels a little othering to me, because there's a much more integration than the statement implies, but I still think it's very important to have such statements. So there is the statement of Western Washington University. So a few things that I'm gonna touch on briefly, with kind of a lot of ground I could cover with making some general remarks about air quality, but I wanted to focus it on kind of 5 main points. And the first point is that breathing is a fundamental human right, probably as much as or more than any other fundamental human right. You can't breathe, you can't live. And so that is really at the core of everything that I think we should remember when we think about air quality issues that face tribes and everyone on this planet. Second is that air pollution doesn't obey colonial borders. It's probably pretty obvious, but it's not obvious in the way that our regulations are written. And as we seek to take a less colonial approach to the way we regulate air pollution, we really need to work across borders. But that said, much of my expertise in terms of air quality regulation specifically relate to the United States framework, such as the Clean Air Act. And so I am going to mostly talk about US issues when we think about air quality. So, but I want to just acknowledge that here in this region, in the Salish Sea region, that's doesn't really represent the reality. Also, not all air pollution is created equal. We'll talk about why the chemistry is important. Indoor air pollution is the least regulated and probably the most harmful exposure that most people have to. And then to give you a few resources, we'll just touch on this briefly about tools for asserting tribal sovereignty, how air pollution is regulated and managed. So in terms of getting back to my first point about breathing being a fundamental human right, this is a study that came out last year which looked at air pollution and dementia. And this map you see on the right-hand side of the slide, if you can see the map, it goes basically in the south from Olympia up to Blaine in the north and the US-Canada border. And it shows that the colors in the map represent the concentrations of fine particulate matter in outdoor air in an annual average. And they did a study of the incidence of dementia and found a pretty strong correlation between exposure to this form of outdoor air pollution and the incidence of dementia. And they said that if you lived in an area that had a 1 microgram per cubic meter higher average concentration of particulate matter, you had a 16% greater risk of experiencing dementia from any cause. And that's a pretty strong correlation and pretty scary when you think about, communities wanting to protect their elders and respect their elders, and many communities having relatively little control over the exposure to this air pollution that's probably being generated from sources outside of their boundaries. So, and getting back to that issue of boundaries, I am really drawn to thinking about things in terms of ecoregions, and really like the construct that was created in consultation with tribes and First Nations of formally renaming this body of water as the Salish Sea region. And that motivated by the geography, the human geography of the Coast Salish people, and cultures and languages that have been here since time immemorial. And so, we have this artificial border that runs through this bioregion, and the air pollution does not respect that border. Air pollution from Vancouver and Victoria can just as easily find its way into the United States as air pollution from Seattle can find its way north, depending on which way the wind is blowing. So, collaboration is going to be key to us creating holistic solutions to our air quality problems in this region. So I'm a chemist by training, and I think a lot about the specific chemistry of air pollution, because sometimes it gets all dumped into one bag, but really it matters a lot what sort of air pollution you're being exposed to and you're talking about in terms of both its health effects and the issues in regulating that air pollution. So I wanted to talk just a little bit about some of the types of air pollution issues that we face. So in one of the ways that we divide it up, both in terms of the science and the regulation, is we talk about primary air pollutants, which come directly from the source, out of the tailpipe, from the construction site, from the forest fire, whatever the source is. And those can include things like volatile organic chemicals, such as benzene that might be emitted from a refinery, to sulfur dioxide and nitrogen dioxide that could come from the combustion of fossil fuels, to particulate matter, so things like soot or dust. And then we have secondary air pollution, which is derived from things that happen after the air pollution is emitted. So it's the result of chemical and physical changes after the pollution's been in the air from a few hours to a few days. And these are things like some of the fine particulate matter that we see, which we talk about stuff that's less than 2.5 micrometers in diameter, which is the EPA designates that. They use the shorthand PM 2.5, or the chemical ozone. Ozone is not usually emitted directly by any industrial source, but it is the result of secondary chemistry that happens in the atmosphere to create that 3-atom ozone molecule, which that when we breathe that ozone molecule, it's a strong oxidizer, so it actually reacts with our tissues, like in our lungs. And if you expose people to even moderate concentrations of ozone, their bodies naturally start to breathe less deeply as they sense that harm to their tissues. So it's not coming directly from tailpipes, though. It's the result of secondary chemistry and physics that happens in the atmosphere. And a lot of that chemistry relies on sunlight. And this is why we see some forms of air pollution, like photochemical smog, are mostly a summertime phenomenon. When we have sunlight and high temperatures that contribute to the chemical stew happening overhead. Some of you probably noticed last week, if you're living in the Salish Sea region, that our air quality didn't look too great. It was quite hazy in the sky. That wasn't from forest fires. Some of it may have been due to just local air pollution, local primary pollution being trapped, but a lot of that was due to photochemical smog, secondary chemistry and physics happening to convert what was being emitted into ozone and particulate matter. And to the point where the Puget Sound Clean Air Agency, as you can see in this tweet that I've included here from last week, warned people that it could be unhealthy to do outdoor activities between 1 and 7 p.m. because of the possibility that ozone and particulate matter concentrations would be high, would be unhealthfully high. And that could be, in this case, that was mostly for sensitive groups. So for people who might have asthma or other compromised lung function. So indoor air pollution is the least regulated and probably most harmful of what people are exposed to. And, you know, most people, certainly myself, I love being outdoors. I love being out in the Salish Sea and my kayak, where I'm very passionate about, you know, being in that environment, experiencing it, and also protecting it. But nevertheless, most of the time I spend in front of my computer or inside, cooking, eating, sleeping, whatever. And the concentrations of air pollutants are frequently higher inside than outside. Now, some of that can be related to pollution that's being transported, that's leaking into our homes from outside, but most of that's stuff that's from inside our homes. You know, we might have a wood stove inside of our house that leaks, that's not perfectly sealed. We might be using a gas stove with a burner, you know, a combustion burner on it, and that produces air pollution inside the house. We might have water damage in our house that might be creating mold. Or we might have poor ventilation that exacerbates all these problems, but can also, for example, take naturally occurring radioactive elements that are in the air in our house, just coming from the ground, and trap them in a way that causes the concentrations to be unhealthy and dangerous. There's also things like, you know, just materials that, you know, you might have a new house that's been created with, you might have plywood and drywall in that house that was manufactured with a lot of formaldehyde. And that formaldehyde is then going to off gas from those new materials into your house, into your living space, which is not good. And obviously, if you're smoking indoors, if someone is smoking indoors, then that's a tremendous source of very dangerous air pollution. Much less is known about indoor air pollution, and it is generally much less regulated than outdoor air pollution. It's harder to regulate, and it's harder to measure because you can't just put one monitor in a city. You would have to measure how many houses to get a representative sample of air pollution inside people's homes. So air pollution is regulated in the United States by the EPA, the Environmental Protection Act. And this is done through the Clean Air Act that was established initially in 1970. And it has been modified, it's been amended multiple times since then. You know, in the United States, legislation gets passed through congressional action, approved by a presidential signature. But then the details of how to implement that legislation get assigned to a federal administrative agency. And the Environmental Protection Agency was actually created that same year in 1970 for the purpose of implementing the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, and the other environmental regulations that were created at the time. So this may be very familiar to some people listening to this if you've studied air pollution regulation, but the Clean Air Act is really built around establishing 6 what are called criteria air pollutants. And they're kind of the canaries in the coal mine. There's thousands of different things that we might consider potentially serious air pollutants in terms of their chemical names and identities. But the EPA chose 6 canaries in the coal mine that they believed at the time would be the key indicators of whether air quality in an area was good enough or not. And those are the gaseous material called ozone that we talked about already, the gaseous material carbon monoxide, and the gases sulfur dioxide and nitrogen dioxide. And then particulate matter as a general category, which could be a lot of different chemical components, and also lead, which could be either in chemical or gas form. And when the Clean Air Act was established, lead was actually one of the most serious health impacts of all the air pollutants. And this is really one of the great success stories of the Clean Air Act, is that it was established by the EPA, that they did research on what was a healthy level of lead that people could be exposed to set a national ambient air quality standard. And really what they found was there's almost no healthy level of lead. And lead was used in many different ways in those days, but one of the main sources of lead in the United States was leaded gasoline. And so because of this process under the Clean Air Act, lead in gasoline was phased out, and lead levels in lead exposure for most people in the United States has dropped dramatically. And so that, because lead has such a huge impact on cognitive development, on children, this is a real public health success story that I think should be celebrated more frequently as we look at both the challenges and successes we've had. But that's how the Clean Air Act is supposed to work. But that process is regulated through, under the Clean Air Act, through state and tribal entities. The Environmental Protection Agency doesn't have its own monitoring network across the nation with its own enforcers going from door to door. They coordinate the process, but they ask the states and tribes who are participating in this process to do the on-the-ground work. EPA sets the standards, EPA checks the results, EPA monitors the progress, but it's the states and tribes who actually do the on-the-ground work. But anyways, so we have national ambient air quality standards for each of these criteria air pollutants. And I want to give one example because I already mentioned ozone as a photochemical air pollutant. And so for ground level ozone, the standard for ozone for outdoor air concentration is that you're supposed to have, to meet the standard, an area has to have less than 70 parts of ozone per billion parts of air over an 8-hour averaging period. And there's some details that I've put in the parentheses there. It's not just one 8-hour average. They allow you to look over a number of years. It's the 4th highest average daily maximum averaged across 3 consecutive years. So it's not just 1 or 2 events that trigger you being declared out of compliance with the standard. It's a pattern. It's a consistent pattern of your area exceeding those air quality standards that would get you in trouble, or would cause the designation to be that you're not in compliance with that standard. So if we look at, for example, Seattle, Seattle has in general been compliant with all the national ambient air quality standards for the last couple of decades. But we see here that there's been some disturbing trends in recent years as to how much air quality has declined in Seattle. One area in particular is fine particulate levels. So this is those PM 2.5 concentrations that I was talking about before. And it's probably no mystery to those of you who live in the Pacific Northwest that this is due to air pollution from forest fires that we've experienced over the last couple of years. So we now have areas of the Pacific Northwest that are not meeting the air quality standard for PM 2.5 because of smoke being transported from fires that many of those fires are outside of the state. Much of that smoke that we're experiencing, that we're breathing, is from outside of the state. So, that does make it a little bit tricky to regulate these things, because if the air pollution is coming from outside of your tribe or state, you obviously have a lot less leverage over any potential sources of air pollution in terms of making sure that your area the air quality standards. And that's one of the balancing acts built into the Clean Air Act. It's particularly challenging for tribes. So under the Clean Air Act amendment of 1990, tribes were set up as co-equals of state governments in terms of air quality regulation. And I would say, as someone who's not an expert in issues of tribal sovereignty, I would say this is a very small but important step towards tribal governmental sovereignty. In this case, specifically around environmental quality, and in this case, specifically around air quality. So before that, states were regulating air quality in tribal regions within the state. After 1990, tribes were given the right to assert their own sovereignty by creating air quality programs within their states, and then creating the plans that EPA would require for doing the required monitoring, planning, and implementation of the air quality regulations at the federal level. And also tribes, of course, have the right to have their own stricter air quality standards if they do so, like if they want to regulate things more than is strictly required by EPA. But of course, for most tribes, if you're in a tribal area, I had the opportunity to work with tribes in the Phoenix metropolitan area, like the Gila River Indian community, which has a very strong tribal air program, tribal implementation plan. They were one of the tribes that early on, after the 1990 amendments, started their own air quality program. But most of the air pollution that is measured on the Gila River Indian community comes from outside of the Gila River Indian community, which is the Gila River Indian community, if you don't know, is adjacent to the Phoenix metropolitan area. And so, the Gila River Indian community works very closely with the EPA, the state, and other tribes to work on planning efforts to help improve that air quality. And one of the big concerns there is hazardous air pollutants that are coming from the Phoenix metropolitan area that may contribute to the incidence of cancer in those tribal regions. And that's the specific project that I was able to, I had the honor of supporting them on with the Institute for Tribal Environmental Professionals at Northern Arizona University. And ITAP is an organization, as you can see the quote here, that strengthens tribal capacity and sovereignty in environmental and natural resource management through culturally relevant education, research, partnerships, and policy-based services. So I've seen them play a really positive role in supporting tribes because, prior to 1990, tribes, most tribes didn't have the in-house knowledge about the regulations and the technical details of air quality regulation. Obviously, tribes had a lot of indigenous knowledge about environmental quality, about the history of air quality, but they didn't have the Western technical knowledge to engage in this process without a lot of work on the part of the tribes, but also supported by organizations such as ITEP. So a pretty important resource, and I'm just going to post a couple of links here just to give you a sense of some of the things that are available through the Institute for Tribal Environmental Professionals. They have a lot of different training courses. Some of those courses are live courses that you enroll in and engage in that help people who have been brought in or have changed roles within a tribal government to work in air quality issues. Some of it's real general background on things like the Clean Air Act, such as I've been talking about at a very superficial level here. And also because ITEP has worked with so many different tribes on the development of their air quality programs, they have a lot of case studies of successful development efforts for tribes that have been working on their air quality implementation plans. And some of those are available on their website. I've posted a few of those here. They also have, many of their courses have been put online so that you can do them at any time, and the videos are available. So I really encourage people to utilize that. This stuff, for the most part, ain't rocket science, but there's a lot of technical jargon. The regulations were not designed to be user-friendly. They were designed to meet, the regulatory goals, and sometimes that means a lot of technical jargon, and it's kind of like learning a new language, right? And that's often the biggest part of it. There's also the need for specific skills in terms of being able to, do the data analysis and the math behind this stuff. So having those sort of skills developed within tribal governments is super important to the whole success of this whole enterprise, which, I think a lot of people, including myself, hope will serve as a model so that in the future, there will be more specific recognition of tribal sovereignty in different forms of legislation, whether that's environmental protection or other forms of the way that we're regulated through the federal government. So I'm actually going to open it up to some Q&A here. If anyone, we don't have a lot of folks here, so I regret that I can't answer questions of those people who weren't able to log on to the Zoom, but I've got my contact information here and would certainly be happy to provide resources. I'm not necessarily an expert in all these issues, but I do have contact with a lot of different resources and would be happy to talk to anyone who has questions. And if anyone who's here today has a question or would just like to bring something up that maybe I didn't fully address, I'd just be very happy to hear that.
All right. Yeah. Thank you so much, Jack. We appreciate you taking the time to share your knowledge with us. We have a question from Shirley in the chat who asks if you could drop those ITEP resources in the chat to add to the brochure that myself and my fellow White Swan environmental interns will be making. And we're also going to be sharing this recording in our brochure and the educational materials as well. So if you wouldn't mind just doing a quick copy paste, we'd appreciate it.
I'm doing it right now.
I just want to thank you, Jack, for attending and also apologize for the glitches. As Stevenson, we're doing the best job we can. But I think your information just complements the other 3 series perfectly. We didn't cover that area before, as far as I know, because I had to miss the first one. But I think it'll be really important, and I can see how it would have been nice to have maybe Jewel James. He did a lot of the policy making around our tribal governance, and I'm wondering whether he knows much about the Clean Air Act, and we'll be outreaching to him. I know one of the prior councilmen had mentioned that he would be a good person to have his information recorded. So I think it will complement what you're bringing forward, and we'll share that with them. Thank you.
And I'm still trying to do the copy paste here for some reason. So far, it's not working, but I'll give it another try here.
No
and
worries.
I might just email them. If this doesn't work, Valerie, I'll just email them to you.
Okay.
Awesome. I'll email you the whole presentation too. But,
oh, perfect. Okay, great.
I think it's working now.
Awesome. Well, are there any other questions for Jack at the moment?
No, I just wanted to say thank you real quick. That was a great presentation. It actually, this last weekend I was driving through Oregon. I saw a little bit of haziness in the sky, so I checked the air quality map, and I saw it was yellow in certain areas. It was green all the way around Whatcom County, but yellow in Bellingham. And this presentation actually kind of cleared some of those questions I had about that. So thank you for sharing today.
You're welcome.
Okay. Well, thank you so much. And oh, Sophia, go ahead.
I wanted to clarify something weird I heard from my friend. You know how certain individuals are really into like forensic files and like weird like murder documentaries and all stuff like that, you know what I'm saying? There's like some people who really gravitate to that, right? One of my friends loves it, and he goes, oh yeah, Ted Bundy this, blah, blah, blah. And I'm like, this is disturbing. Like, I don't like to think that there's people out there that just like go off and kill people, right? And then he goes, well, it's a lot less of a problem now. And I'm like, what are you talking about? He's like, lead used to infect everybody, and it used to like damage people's mental health super bad, and there were more serial killers back then. And I was like, no way. So I haven't had this verified, but hearing about lead and knowing that it damaged like little kids' development and other stuff, I was just curious if that fact is real, or if like how extreme lead affected people.
The impacts are really, really severe. I've never read any research that connected lead exposure to anything as specific as serial criminal behavior, serial murder. But one of the things that, lead from gasoline is not the only source of lead. There's also lead-based paint that you find in a lot of older buildings. So there's, but either of those forms of exposure, the thing that has been pretty well established is that lead poisoning had a disproportionate impact on low income and people of color. And if you think about where the emissions of of traffic are highest in more densely populated urban areas where you might have higher concentrations of low income people, or you have older buildings, which, if you're on a fixed income and you don't have the luxury of repainting your home because you don't have the funds to do that, or having a team come in and literally have to mitigate the existing lead in your home using very expensive techniques, you can definitely imagine how low-income communities, how tribal communities with elders on fixed incomes could have much higher exposure to some of these chemicals. So there's a real social and economic and racial correspondence with these exposures. And so, it's not impossible that you might be able to see in the data, if you did some careful social science and public health research, you might be able to see a correlation between, patterns of social behavior, say in low income people who were exposed to more lead in the early 70s because of leaded gasoline and behavior. But I've never heard of any. I think that's what I would classify that as, just without doing any research on my own, I would classify that as wild speculation.
Thank you. We are in week 8 and ending the air quality program. Valerie Dornbos was our intern from the ITEP program from Northern Arizona University. And she's been working with several of our interns, White Swan environmental interns. And this is the 4th air quality speaker series, and it's called Community Programs and Air Quality. And our goal today was to bring in our local community members to share out some of their experiences or challenges and needs in air quality. And so we were going to bring in Chester Joe from the maintenance department at the Lummi Tribal Health Clinic and let him share out, but he had trouble getting in, as well as Lummi Nation Schools Education Director, Lexi Tom. We invited her, as well as the Lummi Housing Authority and the Lummi Indian Business Council Maintenance Department. And so we did a survey, and there was like 438 people who responded locally. Even in Nooksack, there were people who were experiencing the impacts of radon, which this is all new to us, to actually get lung cancer and to not even be exposed to smoke or anything like that, but then to end up with lung cancer. So to share that out and just share out simple things like Sophia talked about being at Northwest Indian College, and during COVID, they had brought in, she'd tell her story better, but they gave her the Clorox wipes and she mixed it with ammonia. Or the Lummi Tribal Health Clinic having to change all of their filters during the COVID impact, or the LIVC building had pipe leaks, which they had experienced mold issues. And then the Lummi Housing Authority, I know we have that on tape, but department to department, finding out what resources our community has available. That was one thing that our LIBC maintenance mentioned, is sometimes our tribe is not able to fund all of the challenges that our community may experience. So we were trying to find resources. I said, that's something that we could help our community with, is at least putting something together that has tips of where to go. Where do you go to get help if you're having problems like FEMA offered help for the November flooding, which ended up destroying kitchens and really, you know, our smokehouses, our we have trouble with needing new wood stoves. Like our Aunt Bev, she had all of her traditional regalia. It was in her basement and it was totally destroyed. And so she didn't know where to go for resources. And we just learned that FEMA and the Washington State helps with those types of things. And then there was another Columbia Valley, Whatcom County opportunity zone that can help with issues like that. And so we're trying our best to come up with some resources to give to our community. So if you know of any, Jack or Waylon, please feel free to share them here, because we're going to put them on the brochure and send them out, because with 438 people who responded to needing help with these types of issues, we want them to know that we are thinking of them. Their voices don't go unheard, and we're doing the best job that we can to learn more and share that information with them. Thank you.
So in terms of indoor air quality, is that the main area where you want more, you think more resources are needed right now?
Like where if people end up having trouble with mold or wood stove smoke issues or flooding, which can lead to mold, where can they go to find financial help to fix maybe indoor housing problems that our housing authority is not able to handle or help with?
Yeah, I mean, I may not be of much value in terms of since I just never done any sort of investigation about that. But I'll do a little poking around and see if there's anything valuable I can find.
That's what we thought we would do when we send out the brochure, is just, I mean, if we put our heads together as a community, we one mind for the purpose of the work, somebody knows something and we can share that out and then just keep sharing it. So we'll hopefully somebody will get their issue solved. But Waylon, if you have anything to share, like with any things that happened at early learning or any projects that you might be working on. Sorry to put you on the spot. I know you did not agree to be a speaker and you're here in the room, but hey, we're from the Swan family. Okay.
Oh, I'm sorry, I think you're muted.
Hello, everybody. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Waylon Ballew. I am the Language and Culture Coordinator here at Lummi Early Learning Programs. And with preschool, or I've worked with a birth to 5. It's all about setting the stage for life, getting ideas for the children to how to function in the world. A lot of the things that they touch and feel and taste, it's their first time touching some of the stuff, or being exposed to it in person. So STEM wise, we've been getting them to the ideas of what the word is in the language, and then let them touch and feel a tree, to understand what the process of how air comes and is created through day and night. It's setting the stage for them to understand what a healthy environment is. And that's all I can say from my end. I know there are many things that our program could talk about, because we're a community-based program, and we deal with a lot of the families. It's just not about the children who are going to school here. It's about the families, and everything that happens with the families. We tend to hear about them because it affects the child's education. So if I was to talk to our family services, they'd have a lot more information about how our families are feeling about air quality and how it's affecting their child's education, or how it's affecting their life at home and their development. Right now, all I can speak on is how we are get the children exposed to what air is and where it comes from, and how we have this relationship with the world around us and everything else that we have to share air with. Yep, and that's my cue. I gotta go. Thank you for the presentation today. Hy'shqe.
Wonderful. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you
I
for
was
having
not-
me. And as I said, if other questions come up, I'll do a little bit of poking, and I'll send you that PowerPoint in a little bit, Valerie. So you'll have that whole slide deck if it's valuable to anyone. If anyone sees the video and wants to have a copy of that, they're welcome to have it. That can be freely distributed. And if I find anything else about mold, unfortunately, in the research I'm doing about mold, I think I'm finding more scams than legitimate things. So I'd be a little bit I'd be a little bit leery of sharing a resource that I hadn't personally vetted and made sure was legit, because I think there's a lot of people out there trying to prey on desperate people looking for support for issues like mold. But I'm also sure that there are legitimate resources out there. I'm not sure that I will be able to differentiate them.
No worries. We appreciate any information that you can provide. And yes, thank you for sending me the slide set. I'll just make sure to add that on. And if anybody's interested, please reach out to me via email as well, and I'd be happy to forward that information to you. And then Shirley, did you have other thoughts?
No, I don't. I was just trying to catch Waylon before he left, but I had trouble. So we can feel free to end the recording and say, Hy'shqe, thank you. Have a good day, Jack. We really
Yes.
appreciate your presence.